So, yeah, third party cookie is a very technical term, right? So once upon a time in the world of the internet, it was a little bit of a black hole with relation to ones and zeros where people could come and search and look for information. What then happened is for browser systems, they decided to use cookies to start tracking identity. The reason for that is that they wanted to add a little bit of structure and form to how people interacted with the internet. The best way to do that is to associate an identity with someone or a device or an interaction. So third-party cookies effectively became the way people used to have a de facto standard to be able to associate identity with people that were using the web. So it is an attempt at organizing the web, but it was also the form and function of being able to give some structured way to identify users online. I think there are a few different reasons. What has happened, obviously, subsequently, so when the internet started and people really didn't have much understanding around the value of their information and how to get valuable over time. They also had no understanding of where social media platforms would come from. At the time, there was no understanding of what that would be. And so it was a very underdeveloped ecosystem. And so when things are underdeveloped and people are typically early adopters, you explore it quite freely with no real understanding of consequence, with no real understanding of implication. And so as consumers started interacting with the internet and it became mainstream, what we started to see happening is topics around ethics, around data, around privacy, around responsibility became more important for people to be aware of. Also, with the development of platforms like Facebook and Google, we realized that the introduction of other different data platforms that could take your identity and start to do things with it, consumers started to become, more woke, for lack of a better word. So you look at platforms like Facebook, who added to the fact that people could look at your cookies and identify who you are. They created another layer of identity. So you had a profile now. So you weren't just a number. You are now a profile with a name that updates its status, that gives information, that gives location, that posts things. So it is the next level of data identification. But what you can imagine is that the intersection of that data, because Facebook is ultimately a closed system, that intersection with the World Wide Web, when you put cookies into the information you get about people, you then get this wonderful thing they call targeting, which is the fact that we can now find you and we can now speak to you in a way that's more relevant. So what does that do? It helps us as marketers and advertisers. So when we're solving for the big challenges of traditional advertising, which is, you don't really know who you're speaking to, you don't really have much in terms of data to quantify the impact. So enter these platforms that allow you to quantify the impact, know who you're speaking to, and use things like third-party cookies to do so. It became a no-brainer. So ultimately, as consumers have now evolved and we're becoming more woke and people have started to use data for nefarious purposes, it's become more and more of an issue. Not only from a governance perspective, but also from a consumer activism perspective as well. So people have started to realize that their data is valuable and they're actually now trying to figure out how they can have a little bit more control over it. So it's interesting, right? So, as we call it, the movement to eradicate third-party data, I think is more consumer activism, right? And then consumer activism has to evolve. And as people have become more aware of their data and implications thereof, it makes sense that they'd want to understand a little bit more about how to manage it better. But what you must also understand is that the value that is created by third-party cookies and data identification is really high, right? So think about the websites that you've logged into and you've had the ability to just auto-populate a form. That's quick and easy, right? So if you eradicate completely cookies and third-party data, it means you eradicate those kind of things. Now, it makes then for the internet experience to be a little bit more strenuous, and it makes it a little bit more of a negative user experience. So I think we're going to have to find ourselves in a place where we kind of meet almost halfway. I don't think we can get rid of data identification altogether. Why? Because that's the core basis in which advertisers get value. So advertising online is not going anywhere. I think it's just going to become a lot more responsible. And platforms like Google have started to take those steps, using things like Flock, which is effectively about cohorts, right? So as opposed to, individual data, you describe cohorts. So it's starting to become more responsible about it. So effectively, third-party cookies are at not the point of first collection. So effectively, when you look at a website and you come to a website and the website asks you, we're going to be tracking your cookies, are you okay with that? That's the first point of collection, right? So you're saying, yes, I'm okay with it. What then happens is they gather that information in a database, and ultimately there are other people that then can access that information. Those are the third parties that get introduced. Now, when you talk about third parties, they can then have nefarious purposes. They may use your data for things that you don't want it to be used for. They haven't asked for your permission, etc., etc. So you kind of break the chain of command. You know, in detective stories and the FBI, they call it a chain of command. So when you go to a crime scene, you can't touch anything because the first people on the crime scene are going to soil the crime scene. The people who know how to deal with it must be there. So your data is like that. So the chain of command is that when someone asks you, can I use your data to do X, and you say yes, you're giving that person the permission. As soon as someone else uses your data to do something with it, then there's a problem because you haven't given them your permission first and foremost. And because there's lots of technology that works behind it, some of those things can be really automated, and they can start to be a little bit bothersome as far as your own experience is concerned. Yes, there is always a degree of risk, right? There is always a degree of risk because ultimately we're assuming that whoever you're giving your information to, you trust and you know what they're going to do with your information. That's a big assumption, right? So yes, today you may think that Facebook is trustworthy, then there's a data breach and all of a sudden your passwords are made available to the dark web, right? That's a compromise in trust, but you still gave them the right to access your data, right? So yes, there's always challenges and risks even with first-party data, but what is happening is that there's governance now that's starting to tighten up on the people that are collecting first-party data. So you think about GDPR, you think about POPI, that's holding people more accountable to when they collect the data, they have to be more responsible with it, so that there is a little bit of kind of structured governance around even first-party data. When it gets to third parties that are using it, that structured governance is very difficult to ensure and to kind of police and monitor. So I think for brands, there's a huge revolution underway at the moment, right? So, and as far as skills and technology, brands have to start understanding how data and databases work and how platforms like Facebook and how implications of laws like POPI and GDPR, what do those things mean for their brands and their businesses? I think in marketing teams, you need to start having more specialists in those roles who understand how that works. Specialists that have got a technical appreciation, but also an appreciation of marketing. Because even when you get down to how you manage your databases and how you access people's information, that's fairly technical. But the ultimate thing is you're still wanting to advertise, you're still wanting to get your message out there, you're still wanting to brand build. So I think the first thing is that they need to skill up because ultimately those roles don't currently really exist in marketing teams. And so being able to bring some of those skills in is really, really important. The second thing is be open to the change because it's such a fundamental shift in how things have been done. You can either fight it and you can pretend that it's not there, and you'll have yourself kind of backpedaling when things do happen, or you can just embrace it. Go along with it and start doing things actively, right, as opposed to reactively. And I think that includes how you think about data. It includes how you interact with your IT teams, your technology teams, how it means that you collect data from third parties, even as agencies and research houses. All of that is the ecosystem of data that a marketer should be aware of. So I think start proactively engaging with it. I don't think anybody's got the silver bullet per se, but that's what I'll do as a brand. As consumers, yes, we are more woke now. I think the important thing is to be mindful as you navigate the online world. Be mindful of the permissions that you give. Be mindful of the platforms that you log into using other platforms. So when you log into, like a Waze and use your Facebook account, or when you log into, any online store and use your Google account, be mindful of those things. And then lastly, I think once a year, try and go through all your web browsing history and pretty much just audit it. So try and either clear out your cache, try and log out of things that are not necessary, try and log out of apps that you don't use over time because you start to have these open gateways into your main data. And I think those things are really important just for you to start increasing your level of awareness. And secondly, I think the most important thing is when you share data with someone, try and have a good understanding of what that information is, where it's going to end up, and what they're going to do with it. My name is Musa Kalenga, and these are my brave thoughts.